I thought, just like you, well, that's clearly so sensitive. Those kids are never going to even be shown that. They won't be
Correct.
told that. Our kids will be in blissful ignorance that even happened. That's a horrible adult story our children won't hear. How naive is that? I mean, that's just stupid. That is a dumb thing for me to think.
Welcome back to another episode of Making the Leap. It has been a week this week.
Yeah,
right.
We don't always typically do shows like this.
No,
but we're guest free today, and we kind of decided to do a show like this today because of the week we've had and that we've just come off of. Of course, we're talking about as you watch this would have been almost a week ago, last Saturday's attempt on Donald Trump's life, an attempted assassination in Pennsylvania. And it was something that jarred, I think, everyone with a conscience and a soul. I mean, when you see the leading Republican candidate and the former president and, would-be president, should he win another election, nearly, within millimeters of his life being taken, that is jarring. And what do you do with that? I mean, we were talking about this show and that event, and it's been weighing on my mind, I'll say, as a guy who's trying to get better in his Christian walk. And as we talk about a show raising good Christian kids in good Christian environments, how do you talk about these things?
And it really struck me, not just what you just said, good Christian kids. I don't even know that I want to call that we're trying to raise good Christian kids. I'm trying to raise Christian thinkers, kids that, and for us too, where we can look at something such as what just happened with that biblical lens, to approach it biblically, right? And so it happened to also coincide with a Facebook post that I had put up with also last weekend regarding biblical worldview, and it really brought me back to remembering some of the ways I have responded in the past when our kids were sitting in public school. Like, that was actually one of my very first thoughts was, thank goodness, number one, we're not in school. We're not dealing with this in school. But then number two, thank goodness that we only have one left in school. And even if she were in school, should this have happened on a random September afternoon, I would feel so much better about where she's at, having to go in and process this at home as well as in school. Whereas 10 years ago, I was so worried about how our kids would go in and hear about and learn about events like this attempted assassination. I
remember being in public school in second grade in a small rural community when that was back when they had televisions on carts. They had
roll them in.
Wheel the giant box TV on a big cart, and they wheeled it into the, what would be, I guess, the lunchroom/gymnasium. And the entire elementary school gathered, and we all sat on the floor and watched this big box TV, and the first teacher launched into space, and that's the Challenger. And that shuttle blew up in front of all of us.
Yes.
And, I'm in second grade or third grade. That makes my heart
stop. Like, that makes my heart stop.
Yeah.
For you.
We're little kids, and we're watching that thing, and I don't even understand what's happened. We don't know, and everybody just kind of, in a melancholy way, goes marching back to class. I know now as an adult, but I didn't understand as a kid, and you saw teachers crying. And then all the subsequent things that have happened historically that are tragic and huge national events. I have never, until the last couple of years that we've been exploring this show, I've never stopped to consider, and again, this is one of those things where I kind of beat myself up as a parent, good grief. And this isn't even a criticism of anyone but me. And not even you. It's just, why didn't I think more about handing my kids off every day to people that I don't know, and just trusting that when horrible, horrible things happen, and they're going to, we're just handing our kids off to strangers and hope that they come out of that emotionally and mentally well. And I, as a parent, I have to tell you, I now think about everything, not just their educations, but now their emotional well-being. I was content to just hand that off for a long time.
And well, you and I had been talking a little bit about this. For example, when the Sandy Hook shooting happened, our kids were in elementary school, and that was one, again, I'm not even looking at it with a political outlook at all. It was just, number one, I didn't want them hearing about that in school. I didn't want them going there and finding out about it.
How old were the kids then? Do you remember?
Well, I know for a fact I dropped them off because it was December. I would say our oldest maybe 4th or 5th grade. So we probably had, I would say 10, 9, and 6, maybe a little bit younger. They were young.
So I will say about that, not to interrupt your point, but here's what I thought about that then. Again, with my head in the sand and not thinking anything about where we are today, I thought, just like you, well, that's clearly so sensitive. Those kids are never going to even be shown that. They won't be told that. Our kids will be in blissful ignorance that even happened. That's a horrible adult story our children won't hear. How naive is that? I mean, that's just stupid. That is a dumb thing for me to think. And sorry, I'm not piling on here, but I think that's where a lot of parents still believe that their kids are going to be sheltered in school from the outside world. Well, that's too dramatic for the kids to hear. Surely the teacher will keep them from it. There's no guarantee of that.
No, and I think with something like that was a super tricky. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about it in the context of our own kids. It was a hard week. I know it was much bigger than just a week, but obviously, life moves on for people when you're not directly affected by it. That was hard because if you were a teacher, if you had been a teacher, if you currently were teaching, that was in your brain, right? And so my heart was thinking about all those teachers that were going to go into that building the next day and subsequent days, thinking about that. Young teachers, I think sometimes handle things a little bit differently. And I thought just emotion, that's an emotion. You're staring at your classroom of little second graders, knowing that several states away, not too far from where we were, that something like that could happen, right? And so I was worried about the emotional fallout, the emotional impact, but I was also thinking our kids are also going to be around other kids whose parents have no qualms about saying, oh, there was this horrible event. There was this shooting. Guns are terrible. Guns are great. All the different concepts that go around with that. And I remember talking with parents at the time and making phone calls to the school. How are you going to handle this? How, are you telling teachers not to talk about it? Which is what I wanted them to say. I didn't want there to be any conversation, whether it was a fifth grade or a second grade. And of course, I can't control the narrative of every classroom, but I wanted to know.
Isn't that strange if you think about it now? Again, not picking on you because I wasn't thinking about it at all. I just went on autopilot and said, they're not going to tell the kids.
And I was like, 100% they're going to hear about it.
You called and tried to intervene. But that wasn't realistic of you.
No, of course not. But that's my mom instinct at the time.
The point is, the proper response from both of us would be, well, if we want to control things like this, we should have taken that upon ourselves all along.
Yes, because as within any situation, when I have called to say, how are you going to handle this? How are you going to talk about it? I'm doing it for the protection of my own kids. Also putting that out there that I now also think that's best for all kids, which of course that's not reasonable either because I'm not those kids' parents. But I remember just having that, surely, this isn't a smart idea. And the principal was she was a lovely woman. And she said, absolutely, it has no place in conversation. But teachers are still teachers. They're going to talk. Kids are still kids, and families come up with things. And the same thing, I will say, happened with every time 9/11, the anniversary of 9/11 would roll around. I was very much like, what are you going to be doing? Because I only have told our kids so much about these events. I've only told them a little bit about what's happened. Our littlest one doesn't know anything about what's happened, and I wanted to keep it that way. And so my gut response was, let me just call and find out how they're going to handle it and make sure that if they're going to say something about it, it's going to align with what I'm telling my kids at home, because as we well know, that was not the case. Even thinking about 9/11, when I was actually teaching when that happened, and I look back at that now, again, I'm kind of equating it to what happened this past weekend. When that happened, we were told, you're not talking about it. TV's off. We didn't really have cell phones at the time, at that moment. That was still early, pre all that. But we were not supposed to be talking about it. And there were teachers in my building, in other buildings, who completely disregarded that. So now this is middle school age, right? I'm teaching. And there were teachers that were sharing their personal opinions, sharing their grief, sharing their emotion in these classrooms with kids who, it's still that day. It was still that, that morning, that afternoon. All of that got to those kids before their parents even had a chance to come talk to them.
We were in Bible study just this past weekend, and one of the men in our Bible study class, who's older than us, mentioned the
JFK
Kennedy assassination when President Kennedy was shot. Now, this is way back in the 60s, and this is well before, never mind cell phones. This is before most people had access to TVs, and you had to really wait for information. He said that there was chatter that something had happened, but nobody knew what, and so he said his teacher, this goes back to the 60s. His teacher asked him to go down to the office and wait for news to hear what was going on, if in fact there was news to go on. And he heard over the radio in the office that President Kennedy had been assassinated. And then I can't remember what grade he said, elementary?
I think it was elementary.
And he had to go back to his elementary school teacher and class and deliver that news. And he said he remembers his teacher just crumbling at being But this is a system, and this is a setup. This is a dynamic that has been going on. When he said that, I thought, good grief, we've been doing this to our kids
70 plus years
since at least the 60s, and probably before that.
Sure.
And that was back when you assumed most teachers were well intended.
Right. But you still have this crazy different dynamic in family to family to family and household to household of what's appropriate, how much is too much information, how do I want it approached? And now as I look at things where I want it to be, approaching things in prayer, biblically, what is the biblical truth in what's happening compared to what's the secular message that's happening now more than ever. And it just makes sense to me that parents take control of what their kids are hearing. Because you're right. I never ever thought back on that day of the Sandy Hook shooting, it did not cross my mind to say, man, if I don't want them hearing about it at school, I need to keep them home. I instead was just thinking, well, school needs to know that that's not appropriate for them to be discussing, so you should not be, but then as things progress, we have elections, we have other events that have, of course, they're hearing a lot that has been antithetical to what we have talked about at home. And I always would say like, oh my gosh, so-and-so, one of the kids came home with a story. I had to sit down and be like, that's not, there was a day, I'm sure I don't know if you remember this, but one of our kids came home saying that the media specialist in the building had been talking about a presidential candidate. I'll just leave the name off. And said, well, so-and-so has some pretty great ideas. Free college sounds good. So our son came home and said, so-and-so wants free college. And I said, oh my gosh. I said, what? And so we had to go back through it and say, well, that's not accurate information, right? That's not how the world really works. And even then, it still never crossed my mind. I wanted to call that teacher and say, what are you doing? Rather than look at ourselves, what are you doing?
So in order to do this well and right, particularly when you're talking about an attempted assassination of a guy that half the country hates and thinks is Hitler and has been calling him Hitler for 7 and 8 years, and you saw some of the most odious, awful things said about him,
right?
Inevitably, your kids are going to be exposed to that if you're handing them over in a public setting, and that these kinds of things are going to keep happening. I'm sorry to say.
Sure.
The world's a fallen, ugly place.
Right.
And this is yet another reason, we call the show Making the Leap. We as parents waited for too long. We're admitted, I'm laying bare to you now, I waited for too long. I wasn't thoughtful enough about these things. And we've now lived through, we've just talked about it, in just recent memory. We've lived through 9/11 and COVID and a Challenger explosion. And but going all the way back to the 60s and the Kennedy assassination, these are kids that have been handed over, including us, and we've handed our own kids over. Generations of kids who have been handed essentially to strangers to navigate some of the nation's biggest tragedies. And in most cases, without any biblical, scriptural, God-breathed counsel in any of it. And that's a mistake that if I could take back as a parent, I certainly would.
And it's funny, throughout the years, because our kids sometimes would overlap teachers and things like that, if something were to happen, something kind of crazy or scary, if they were in a certain classroom, I was like, okay, they're going to be okay. I know how that teacher's going to handle it because I know she's a Christian or he's a Christian. And then I would also think, well, that person also has a little bit more common sense or that one doesn't. And, I just kind of want to kick myself now. I don't sit in a place of regret all the time, but that's the other piece, right? Is that if we are going to have our kids in all these varying kinds of situations, if you are a parent who has your kids sitting in a government run school, if you have that, you have to be equipping them. And I don't know that we equipped our kids well to not only hear what was coming at them, but to dissect it and know how to refute it, which is part of that whole idea of filtering, through that biblical lens. So I think those are really, really important pieces. It isn't just about pulling them, it's about equipping them and equipping ourselves as parents, knowing how to handle and address, yes, we are in a fallen world. That is the message in the Bible. And here is what God did to combat that. And we have to make sure that message is getting to our kids as well.
Yeah, and this is for me, personally, when you talk about the attempted assassination of somebody that's this polarizing that I personally happen to support for President of the United States, one of the things that I don't want to relay to my children is a viciousness or a vindictiveness that I know a lot of this country feels. And I understand it. I do. I mean, on a human level, I understand the anger. And, I do a radio show in a world that is not especially biblically based, certainly. I mean, it's not my call. I'm trying to share a little more of my own testimony on my radio show. But the truth of the matter is, even in a conservative audience, there are people that want their pound of flesh. They're angry. They are mad that we're a country that's driven to a point where somebody feels emboldened to take a president's life. And so we're in an environment where people, I fear, and I was asking a friend of mine the other day, it feels like there's a healthy number of people out there that they want their pound of flesh. They want to get even. Mm-hmm. And I would hate that I would impart that to my kids. Not that you are passive and not that you don't engage, but how do we, and I don't mean turn it down like
not ignore it, because there's a big difference, right? You don't ignore it. Don't brush it under the rug. Don't say we're just going to tuck it into our little home and be done. That's not it.
But I said to my audience, how do we turn our anger and our despair to action? And if you really want to impact this and change it, and you don't care for the direction of the country, how engaged are you? Are you voting? Are you registering? Are you engaging? We're still called to do those things. But to think that the younger kids would be soaking in that kind of divisiveness and anger when something like that happens. Again, as you say, thankfully it was during a summer time where most kids are not in school. But there's no reason to believe it wouldn't happen again.
No, and but I really did, even for our kids that are older, that are in college classes. I was like, well, thank goodness they're not there either. Of course, they're hearing it on social media, but it's that idea of like we get to it first. We lay some groundwork first and make sure that we're having conversations so that when they walk through those doors, whatever grade it is, they've got tools. Like they've just got tools to combat it, because it isn't just about an assassination. It's every topic that seems to be, coming down the pipeline from wherever, whether it's California or Montana or DC.
And that politics isn't the end-all be-all. Politics isn't our religion, This was, when that event happened, interestingly, my first gut instinct on my podcast was to call our pastor. And I asked him, help me walk through this. I want a godly reaction to it. I want to know how to process this from the Word of God. And, it's to keep this broader perspective that this country is a vapor. The United States is a thing that was not around when Christ walked the earth, and someday it will cease to be a thing again.
Right.
Our kids cannot be raised in an environment where the only thing that matters is political brinksmanship in the United States of America. That can't be our sole focus, and it can't be what you spend all of your energy on, jousting with people, teachers, other students, neighbors, friends about the best way forward in politics. That can't be our existence. And I think our kids are learning that, and often in public school.
They are, or they're learning the opposite, that there is no place for discussion on any of it in school.
That's
and I
right.
also
and to be
don't
a good
necessarily
Christian,
right. You know what I mean?
To be a good Christian means to sit it out and not, that's
and we can't. Like I would prefer there be conversation, but I also want to know who is leading the conversation as our kids are younger.
Yeah.
Now, as they're older, I can't control that. Our oldest walks into the restaurant where he works. I can't control any of that, but I want to know that he has a base. Whereas I think in school now too, it's either you've got a lot of people with an agenda, or you've got a lot of people who hands off, we're not touching it. And neither of those are realistic options when we live in the world that we live in.
So it's not necessarily a prescription. This is not necessarily something that we can tell you how to handle it, but it is yet another case that we felt on our heart when we were talking about this. if ever there were another instance where you, at least I, as an adult with children, stare at myself in the mirror and say, okay, this awful event, how do I want it framed in my kids' minds? Today, I know that answer is I want it framed biblically. I want it framed through the lens of God's Word. And that wasn't me years ago, but it is me now. And so I hope with this show and people that listen to it, that's what we kind of nudge you to do on our behalf as parents with older kids now. Don't make the mistake that we did. And if you can possibly do it, make the leap and take control of your kids' futures. And when bad things happen, and they will, don't be parents like we were that said, gosh, I hope the teacher handles this well today, because the odds are that you're going to handle it far better than some stranger who's maybe not handling it well themselves, no fault of their own.
Sure.
It's the way it should be.
Just simple, right, just simple lack of knowledge, things like that. I think it's a much better idea to do it yourself.
There's other news this week, and we just thought we'd do kind of a headline show. I thought this an interesting one from the Washington Times, and it's been a show that we have talked about before, and that's the development of trade schools. Trade school enrollment booming. This was here in the month of July, that high school grads are now shunning costly four-year degrees. Profiling a guy named Vince Gregg, principal of Blue Ridge Technical Center in Front Royal, Virginia, says he learned the hard way about the costs of accumulating 4 years of college debt. Gregg graduated from the University of Virginia in 2005 with a bachelor's degree in government, but he couldn't repay his $60,000 in student loans until he obtained a master's degree in education and a teaching license. But now, this guy is training 600 students from 2 public high schools in Warren County, Virginia, to become cooks, auto mechanics, electricians, biomedical techs, police officers, instead of pursuing 4-year college programs that may not pay their bills.
Wow.
Great. So if you want to look up that story, trade school enrollments boom as high school grads shun costly 4-year degrees in the Washington Times, I recommend it. I don't mind sharing with you a little bit about our own personal story related to this.
Yeah.
Our oldest son is just this kind of kid. While we didn't get into Christian school with him, one thing that we did have a serious conversation about was this very thing.
Well, and before we even got to the college age, we did try multiple avenues with him. We didn't try Christian school, we didn't try homeschool, but we did try online school, we tried alternate schedule school, we tried a lot of different things just because we knew we had a smart kid on our hands, struggling. There were just some issues, right? There were just some issues.
So he's been working in a restaurant and killing it. I mean, all of a sudden, the kid, we find out, is crazy about selling. He's great at sales.
And it makes sense, right? Because we've spent the last amount of years with his little mouth running at different times. And we would always be like, man, if you could channel that would be amazing.
And we didn't see it coming, but the kid who's not particularly interested in academics, and we knew better than to send him off to an expensive 4-year school, he's interested in sales in a restaurant all of a sudden. He's upselling people on desserts and drinks and things like that, and he, in fact, has been leading in that capacity. Well, he started working in a bank here recently as a teller.
Right.
And in no time at all, he's leading, and I'm not making this up, and I know I'm sounding like a bragging dad, but I'm sharing with you, this is a reason. I'm not sharing this just to be a boastful dad. I'm sharing this is the point.
It's an example.
Instead of forcing our son to go off to a 4-year university because you got to do it because that's the only way you're going to get a good job, son, we said no. Instead, I think I'm going to co-sign an apartment for you for a year and you go figure it out on your own. And it was scary.
Right.
And it was tough. And now he's doing 2 jobs, but the kid is killing it. And he's got this fever to sell. And he's now leading in bank product sales as a teller, and he's already advanced to like a banker in just a few months, and he's excited. It's like this switch flip. Now, he's got a harder road ahead of him.
Yeah.
He's going to have to pursue some kind of higher level of education simply because if he wants to advance in banking. But the point is he found this thing organically that he was passionate and excited about, and he didn't have to go off to a big expensive school to figure it out. He did it backwards and maybe a little tougher, but I think he's going to be better for it.
And he didn't do it. I think we have to start rephrasing our conversations. I don't even want to say he did it backwards because then we're just saying that the only other way is the right way,
That's
right?
Better.
I mean, I think it's something to say he did it his way. It's the, Frank Sinatra thing. He chose the path. And that's kind of what we have to start as parents continuing to embrace, is this idea that we don't have to do here to here, done. And it's not backwards if you go to the apartment first, then figure it out. I mean, obviously you have to have a job, and our son was figuring that out, and he was figuring out that even doing well in the restaurant, working as he was working, was going to be barely cutting it. And so he had to kind of step it up and figure things out. And he did it also with things that interest him. And we know nothing about the banking industry. We know nothing about the finance world, right? There's nothing.
We want to learn it.
I know. Yeah. And never would I guide him that direction anyway. Even when we talk about trade school with him, we would offer him suggestions, and he was like, no, not for me, not for me, not for me. And he had to go figure it out. So I don't even call it a backwards
But I
way.
know that there are people in our lives, friends of ours right now, who won't admit it, but you can tell they kind of stare at you blankly like, you let your 19-year-old son do what now? He lives on his own and he works 2 jobs. What? Blink, blink, blink. And you can almost feel it. Right. You can feel our peers saying, you mean you're letting him do this by himself? And I can feel the judgment piercing from their eyes, even though they won't say it. You know what I'm saying?
I do, because it's a hard thing for me now, sitting where we sit, to also, and this is just me being honest, not look at some of them with a little bit of judgment too. And I have to temper that. Like, why on earth are you making your kid go to a 4-year school when he has no business going, barely got out of high school?
No self-control.
Right. Like, why are you doing? So it's kind of that. I get it. I get their pushback, but I also kind of understand where I'm at too. So we're human, so we have to figure that out. The idea being, we want our kids to, number one, recognize whose they are in charge, who's in charge of what they are doing overall. And it's not us. But that aside, we want them to figure out their path on their own, using their own skills in the best way that they know how. And that does not mean sitting in a class every day, going to different schools, living on a campus where everything is still kind of provided for you. And that, he's just doing well how he's doing it. And so I don't want to call it backwards anymore.
And I think things are changing. We've talked a lot on the show about this. It feels culturally like things are changing. Everything that used to be familiar and everything that used to be traditional, I think everything's changing. The explosion of homeschool, the notion that you do not have to go off to a 4-year college, it's all changing.
And our second son, our middle son, also, I think he also will go finish at a 4-year college, but he's not going to start at a 4-year college.
By their own. And we should say this was not at our encouragement. This was their own decision. They came to us and said this is what they wanted to do.
And this isn't a Christian thing, but it's just an illustration of it doesn't have to be the status quo. We can kind of break that chain idea, but I think his is probably more of a financial piece. He's also working close to 40 hours with his job. I mean, he's doing things in a different path.
But watch this. They're not going to march off to a 4-year institution and come home as indoctrinated little brown shirt weirdos.
I'm sure we're going to have to fight a little bit of that. Well, we already talked about this.
But I feel like they're staying closer to home and they're kind of going about their own lives as opposed to marching off immediately into some indoctrination camp again.
Well, and even think about just this weekend, we were able to connect with all of our kids. They're not off at school. They're not running around. Like, we were able to sit down and be like, hey, this is some big news this weekend. And I'm grateful for that, because I know a ton of people that have already sent their kids off to school. They were sitting out there living through something that for us was unprecedented. We've never experienced an attempted assassination of a president before. It shook me up. I mean, that was a hard weekend. It's been a hard week. And these are still kids with not fully developed brains, still processing, still learning. And I'm so grateful that because they're choosing to do something that is maybe a little not ordinary, that it gives us a little bit more time with them, and allows them to be in the real world, seeing the effects of what's happening versus in a sheltered environment, or non-sheltered environment, I guess, of school.
When Dave Ramsey talks about finances, he says, be weird. And I think that applies to educations and raising kids. Be weird, whatever that means. And that's not us telling you what to do or how to do it, but that is encouraging you, break this cycle of there's got to be the one way. No, there doesn't. Times are really weird, and I think it's time we respond by being weird and taking matters into our own hands as parents. We've got to do it.
Well, speaking of being weird as parents, the other piece that jumped out at me, and this was from The Lion, which is one of the publications from the Herzog Foundation, and you can always find their
right?
You can always find their stories. This came out of California, that residents of California revolts. This was the title, after California bans school districts from requiring parental notification of gender changes.
Newsom just signed this week. The
and
governor
you want
of
to talk about be weird as parents, like if you're okay with the fact that he's okay with saying, as parents, you don't have a right to know what's happening with your own children. I've never come across a story that had me thinking, you've got to be smarter than this as a parent. You've got to understand. There was a representative that spoke on behalf of the bill, or about the bill, not on behalf of the bill, spoke about the bill. And he said, well, I don't think it's unreasonable that parents know the changes that are happening in their child. And I thought, you don't think it's, of course, it's like, why would you want a parent to not know anything about what's happening with their kid?
Why is it a discussion?
So why is that even an option for you? And so when you say be weird and know what's happening and, be aware of that. Now, there were a lot of people very against it, which I actually think is the bigger story. I think that there were so many people that are flipping out about this, and they're angry about what's happening, that he did this, that he basically said, you as parents don't need to know what's happening. We know best. And a lot of the comments that were coming out, when the story posted in California, people calling, well, evil. What you're doing is the face of evil. You're celebrating groomers. People saying, protect your kids, leave the state. Is this bill titled, don't tell your parents, this is our secret? Like, what a time to go ahead and say, be weird. Go ahead and pull back from something like this.
Yeah, and this, again, I think if you believe, oh, well, that's California and that's what Californians do, trust me when I tell you, in every state of the union, wherever you listen to this show, there are districts, maybe even yours, who have people who believe that the relationship that they have with your kids is some intimate, private thing that they can keep from you. That is becoming the prevalent view in the public school square, that kids and teachers can keep secrets from parents, that you are on the outside and you're almost the enemy combatant, and they've built some kind of relationship that once upon a time you were taught, never to be alone with strangers. Right. And now we're developing this dynamic where
keep the secret.
Yeah, and hide in the back of the van with the stranger. Mm-hmm. It's weird, but that's where we are.
It's super creepy.
On that note, it's kind of a related note, the Title IX discussion, which is going to be part of this Republican platform. It's a big part of the Republican platform is keeping women and women's sports. Riley Gaines is coming to town soon.
I'm excited for that.
And we're going to have Riley on this show in a couple of weeks, live in studio, which is cool, and a big discussion. This is going to be another fascinating discussion culturally as we head into an election this year. It's yet another, just like this transgender thing and teachers keeping secrets, another component is whether or not our girls in sports and the locker room and bathrooms are going to be kept from biological males sharing those spaces. That is another cultural discussion. Her
story really resonated with me the first time we spoke with her on our podcast, and it really took me by surprise because I didn't know the full extent of her story. And it was another one of those issues where we have so many issues right now. We have so many things that are, pulling for our attention in our space that I hadn't given that one as much weight at the time when the news broke with her, when she had to step down from the podium, all that. I didn't like it, but I didn't dive into it. I didn't pay as much attention as I probably should have. It seemed
too fringe.
It did not. I felt like this is an exception to the rule, and now it's become the norm. And so I do think a lot, even now, knowing what we're doing, knowing what we're focused on, knowing what we want for families, just to be aware is to take the opportunity to dive into stories like this and learn, because that was at the college level. Well, then what have we seen now? Multiple stories of this happening at the middle school level. And I thought, well, that's there, that's not here. It's now, like you just said, it's everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's California or if it's Florida. It doesn't matter if it's college level or elementary. In other words, it's deep and wide, pervasive everywhere, whether it's gender issues, whether it's, transgender issues, whether it's Title IX, whether it's, I don't know, the border, like whatever it is, there's all kinds of issues that require attention and focus. And that's, I don't know, I just think opening your eyes to that kind of stuff is important.
And if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, it's all through that biblical lens. That is the point. The point is ultimately we have a whole generation of young people that are so desperately sad and anxious and lost and despairing. And you can point to any number of reasons why that is. Maybe it's COVID, maybe it's phones, maybe it's all of the above. I don't know. But one thing it definitely is a lack of a relationship with Jesus. It is a lack of knowledge that you have been fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image. And if kids aren't introduced to that at home and have it affirmed when they leave that house, this is what you're setting yourself up for. This is what we're all setting ourselves up for. Kids who are lost and wandering and highly impressionable and vulnerable to wickedness. I mean, real darkness. So I think we did a pretty good job. We certainly could have done better. And gosh, if there's anything I really want to impart on younger parents, it's not too late for you. You can do this well and do this right and share the love of the Lord in your kids' lives so that they're not vulnerable to this mess.
You're just giving them a base. I think just sometimes giving people a base of a place to start is so incredibly important. And it breaks my heart when I come across, when I'm in conversation with people who don't have that, don't see the problems. And I just think they're here. They're here. They're in every story that we come across. And it's hard to, as a person, I think, to not lose hope a little bit, that you just think everything is crazy. But it's not, because we have people like Riley Gaines. We have people, talking about homeschooling. We have people helping others form new schools.
Oh, we have the Herzog Foundation.
We have the people like the Herzog Foundation. We have this across the country, and for a reason. So that I think for parents, for our audience members, people that are listening, I would really encourage you to reach out to someone who is maybe schooling a little bit differently, educating a little bit differently. Find a church that might be impactful to you. If you need to church shop a little bit or school shop a little bit, I think it's totally okay to do it.
This is the time of year.
Yes.
If you're thinking maybe not another fall where we put the kid back on the bus, maybe this is the year. Here we are, smack in the middle of summertime. Right. This is the time that you could really make a decision. There's any time.
If you're a teacher that maybe it's like, I can't do this, kind of like how we had that conversation with the Oettles a little while back, and she said Lacey, the wife, said it's a year to year. It's a year to year decision, and so maybe this is the year that you're thinking, I don't want to do this. I need to go teach in a place where I can be who I need to be openly as a Christian, and that's an important thing to think about too when we talk about making the leap.
And if you're a newer listener to this podcast, I always encourage you to go back and start at the beginning. We've done a whole library of shows over the last 2 years on so many different topics for teachers and people starting schools or people that have made the leap. So please go back and either refresh yourself or introduce yourself to the first shows we did from the very beginning where we told this story and sort of walked through this. I think you'll find it a source of encouragement, and certainly continue to go to the Herzog Foundation. Sign up for trainings if, in fact, you're already part of a school, or maybe, like you say, you're thinking about leaving public school, but you want to continue teaching. But there's a litany of resources at herzogfoundation.com. So here we are in the middle of summer, and as we head quickly, here we fall.
Oh my gosh, I can't even believe. Yeah.
It is never too late. Always a good time to think about it if it's on your heart to make the leap. So that'll do it for this week.
Yes.
Like I said, in a couple of weeks, Riley Gaines will be here. That's very exciting. We're going to have something like 400, 500 people.
A lot of people. I am very, very much looking forward to this. She's just an inspiration.
We're going to be doing something really unique and new here, too. I think through, I know through the Herzog Foundation site. I don't know if we're going to do it through our social media. Maybe. I'll let you know more. We're going to try live streaming an event with Riley and a huge live audience at a facility nearby. So that's going to be cool. A live show that you can stream.
Right, which would be amazing, because you're limited on time, you're limited on option, but we all know we can use.
The date on that is July 24th. That's a Wednesday.
It's a Wednesday night.
So I would mark that on your calendar now, July 24th, that evening around 7 p.m.
I think so.
Yeah, 7 p.m. Central.
And if that's wrong, we will we'll correct it.
The Herzog Foundation website will have more information. But that's going to be exciting if you want to watch in on that event. And, of course, she'll be here in studio with us, too. So that'll do it for this week's edition of Making the Leap. And we hope that you will come back and see us very, very soon. Make sure you give us a 5-star review and a written review. We hope that you'll do that. And as always, thanks for supporting the show. We'll see you next time.
Making the Leap is a podcast presentation courtesy of the Herzog Foundation. We'd love your feedback by rating us and commenting on the show.
And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Making the Leap.